Hello and welcome to Gin with Gwynne. I'm Oliver Gwynne, and this is where I give you my off-the-cuff and unrehearsed thoughts on marketing, data and philosophy. I'm looking very orange today. I'm in a hotel room instead of my normal filming location, so I look a bit odd. I've been thinking a lot this week about emotional intelligence and the paradox of knowing yourself better does not always lead to better results. And my thought started about intelligence in general is always isolating. The more that you know, the more it isolates you. The higher your intelligence, the more alienated you are around the people around you because you know more than them. And I think it's not often a said thing, but that's true of emotional intelligence too. I think we are in an area where we are more conscious of emotional intelligence than we've ever been in the history of humankind ever before. But the problem that creates is that understanding yourself more clearly gives you a sense of clarity that not everybody has, and often that you can understand yourself better and your actions than other people around you, and that can create a frustration and a gap of understanding. And so the standard sort of emotional intelligence narrative that we are fed is just that understanding your emotions will make you better at managing them. And there's this version of that where you understand your patterns so completely that it changes almost nothing. And that's what I'm sort of interested in today. So you can watch yourself getting defensive in a meeting. You can know exactly why it's happening. You can trace it back to whatever formative experience you had, but you'll still be defensive, and maybe you'll apologize quicker or you'll change that behavior quicker, but it will still happen. And nobody really talks about this, that insight doesn't automatically produce the behavior change in the same way that data doesn't automatically produce a behavior change. They're often treated as two separate things, and conflating them is where a lot of this discourse sort of falls apart. And so you can make yourself a more accurate observer of your own worst habits, but if you don't change them, then what exactly is the point? The promise of emotional intelligence is sort of Socratic in its nature. It's that if you know what good is, you'll do it. And so Socrates says in Protagoras that no one who even knows or believes that there is another possible course of action better than the one he is following will ever continue on his present course. And the logic is baked into a lot of ideology around emotional intelligence, that awareness equals change. But Aristotle kind of disagrees with this, and one of his quotes is that the man who acts against reason does not have knowledge in the full sense when he is overcome by passion. And so he gave it a name, acrasia, which is a weakness of will, and he treated it as a permanent feature of human behavior rather than a gap that insight fills. You can know what the right thing to do is, you could still not do it. And I think I agree with Aristotle here that humans are always flawed creatures. It often takes many years to change any kind of behavior, big or small, and often we will go back a step in that process and have to go forward, and we will make progress, and then we will revert back to old patterns a lot of the time. So any form of change is typically more difficult than we maybe anticipate. When you develop a very precise model of your own emotional patterns, the danger can actually be that you start to feel like a spectator of yourself, and you can do all of this navel gazing almost, and that you become a participant rather watching the machinery kind of run rather than being present in the moment. And that's sort of a strange and lonely place to be. I mean, Nietzsche, of course, said that if you stare into the abyss will gaze back into you. And so the abyss here is yourself. Prolonged self-scrutiny changes what you find, and not always for the better. You can examine something so long that it changes what is true. And that is also true in business and life, that you can look so much into the data that you start to see something that's not really there. Sartre in Nausea said that, I am, I exist. I think, therefore I am because I think. Why do I think? I don't want to think anymore. I am because I think I don't want to be. And the point there is that self-knowledge is, it's not that self-knowledge is bad, it's just that a certain kind of relentless self-analysis always creates distance and disorientation. Understanding can be isolating in a way that ignorance isn't. And in practice, this shows up as people who have done therapy, they've done the personal development work, and they find themselves slightly outside of themselves, always half watching for their own reactions, always having to rely on the routines and the processes that they've built out, rather than just sort of being in that moment. In business, we kind of look at the work of Daniel Goleman. I'm hoping that's how you pronounce his name. I pronounce everybody's name wrong. But he produced a best-selling book called Emotional Intelligence in 1995, and there was a follow-up book in 1998, Working with Emotional Intelligence. And he tried to translate this into a corporate framework, arguing that emotional intelligence was a better predictor of professional success than IQ. Also, he found that it's a better predictor of financial wealth. It's the number one thing, even if you come from a poor family, if you have high emotional intelligence, you're more likely to be rich than the other way around. And so a lot of things about success in life are tied to understanding yourself well. And it's a claim that got embedded into a lot of leadership development programs, feedback tools, HR competency frameworks across most large organizations, that if you've ever sat through a workshop about self-awareness or empathy as a leadership skill, Goleman is basically the reason for that. And so his own framing on that was quite ambitious. He said, in the last decade or so, science has discovered with a tremendous amount about the role that emotions play in our lives. Researchers have found even more than your IQ that your emotional intelligence and abilities to handle feelings will determine your success and happiness in all walks of life. And that's a very strong causal claim that subsequent research has largely failed to support, to the level that he's sort of suggesting there. A 2004 meta-analysis by Locke argued that emotional intelligence, as Goleman defined it, wasn't a coherent intelligence at all, but a collection of personality traits repackaged under a more marketable label. And so the problem with this framework that Goleman presents is that it got adopted into sort of measurement and outcome-based and not really connected. How do you measure somebody's empathy apart from in situations where that comes to be very, very important? How do you tell if somebody's acting with kindness, and all these kind of ridiculous frameworks that a lot of businesses have that are part of their identity and culture and all this kind of stuff? And that's where it maybe from a business point of view became sort of a bad thing. The darker finding comes from research, and I'm looking at these names and I'm like, I'm going to get this wrong. Kilduff, Chaiburu, and Menges in their 2010 paper, Research in Organizational Behavior, and they argued that emotional intelligent people are skilled at reading social situations and can use that skill strategically and manipulatively, not just to serve others, but to steer them. And so their framing was that high EI individuals may use emotional understanding to further their own interest at the expense of others. And so it's not always a good thing when understanding emotions can be used against people. And Aristotle weirdly kind of chimes in with that. He says, we are, of course, what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. And the problem with emotional intelligence as sort of a corporate intervention is that it focuses on understanding rather than habit formation. And those are different things requiring different kinds of work. And so my thought, I guess, is what Aristotle says is, of course, incredibly true. We are what we do. Success is what we do repeatedly. We all know this to be true. William James wrote in Principles of Psychology that the hell to be endured hereafter, of which theology tells, is no worse than the hell we make for ourselves in this world by habitually fashioning our characters in the wrong way. So he kind of understood that character is built through repeated action, not through insight, and that understanding your patterns is the beginning of the work, not necessarily the end of it. And so while there's a lot of YouTubers and influencers and all these things that are focused on trying to understand your emotions, which I think is, of course, a good thing, it's all for nothing if you then don't change your patterns of behavior. And it's not always so easy to link those two things up because it can be very specific to yourself. And so it's harder for anybody to talk about, I do this because of this reason, and so I need to start doing this. So how do we close this gap out? Well, maybe we don't, I think that emotional intelligence gives you a map, but the territory only changes when you start actually walking down different paths repeatedly until that becomes the default. In business terms, that means designing environments and structures that force the behavior that you want, rather than relying on self-awareness to generate it sort of spontaneously. And the truth is that some things don't change. People don't always change. They get set in their way. And knowing that is also very useful. Not everything about your emotional wiring is sort of plastic. Something is structural, it's temporal, it's deeply embedded. And it's not realistic that transformation, but management is a more realistic goal on that. Maybe you're still going to get frustrated in that meeting, but you cannot lash out because of it. You can take a breath and still get frustrated and show it in a different way. A leader who knows that they're poor at making decisions when anxious doesn't stop being anxious. They need to start making decisions when anxious. And that's a more honest and more actionable use of emotional intelligence than this transformation narrative sometimes offers. And so the interesting conclusion to my thoughts this week was that the tension might not be resolved. The gap between understanding of our behavior isn't necessarily a problem to be solved. It's a permanent condition of being reflective as people, being reflective as organizations, and trying as ever to then form that into solid little actions that we can take, and remembering that in most cases the best way to form habits is through really small changes, and not through I'm going to run a marathon and therefore I'll get fit. It's through I'm going to start walking down the stairs instead of taking the lift. I'm going to walk when I pick up my shopping instead of getting it delivered, and all of this kind of small things. That is the real way to make change. And so, yes, we are what we do repeatedly. It's very useful to understand ourselves. Understanding yourself better than others can be isolating, but it's all for naught if you don't actually change anything. These have been my thoughts for the week. Hope you found this useful and interesting. Tune in next week for another Gin with Gwynne.